Good evening. My name is Jennifer Frey. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy here at the University of South Carolina. I am the principal investigator, along with Candace Vogler from the University of Chicago, on a research project titled Virtue, Happiness, and Meaning of Life, which has been generously funded by the John Templeton Foundation. I'm very happy to welcome you here tonight to our first public event here at the University of South Carolina. Candace and I are very, very, very glad you're here. Tonight's lecture kicks off a week of intensive, collaborative, interdisciplinary research, which will take place over the next 28 months, both here at the University of South Carolina and also at the University of Chicago. Our research is focused on self-transcendence to advance understanding of the interrelations between virtue, happiness, and meaning of life. By fostering intensive collaboration between philosophers, religious scholars, and psychologists, we are investigating whether self-transcendence helps to make ordinary cultivation and exercise of virtue a source of deep happiness and meaning in human life. Okay, so I just want to make a few brief remarks about tonight's lecture. First, it's being live streamed on the web. Second, Professor Haldane's lecture will be followed by a 15-minute question and answer period. So if you'd like to ask Professor Haldane a question, please just raise your hand and I will bring a microphone to you. After the Q&A, we are hosting a reception in the lobby of the law school. We'll have food and drinks, and we encourage you to join us. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Anne Bezuidenhout, who's going to introduce Professor Haldane.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I'm very impressed with this crowd that have showed up tonight. You might know that it's the end of the exam week. In fact, today was the commencement ceremony when we were granted over 1,000 degrees, undergraduate and master's degrees, and I personally shook hands with about 400 of them, who are the arts and sciences graduates. So I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the university and the College of Arts and Sciences. We were not the sponsors of this event because, as you heard from Jennifer, this is part of a grant-funded project. 2.1 million, I think it is, grant from the Templeton Foundation for this project over the next few years. And of course, so one of the things I have to tell you is how much we love Jennifer in the college, because when somebody on the liberal arts side can actually show those natural science guys that we can get the big bucks too, that's always a very good thing. So we are very pleased that she has brought distinction on us in this way. So my next task is basically just to introduce our speaker for tonight, John Haldane, who's a professor of philosophy and the director of the Center for Ethics, Philosophy and Public Affairs at the University of St. Andrews, and the J. Newton Rayzor Senior Distinguished Professor in Philosophy at Baylor University. He's made significant philosophical contributions across a wide range of subject areas, including ethics, education, aesthetics, social philosophy, history, metaphysics, philosophy of mind and action, and philosophy of language. He's the author or editor of 15 books and over 200 scholarly articles. Some of his book titles include Seeking Meaning and Making Sense, Reasonable Faith, and Spirituality, Philosophy, and Education. He's one of the principal architects of a philosophical approach called analytical Thomism, which seeks to infuse the methods and problems of contemporary Anglo-American analytic philosophy with insights from the thought of Thomas Aquinas and his followers. He's, of course, had many academic honors and distinctions. I'm not going to go into the long list of them in the interest of getting the ball rolling on this night's event. But I also just say that he has also reached out in a public way, which is obviously one of the reasons that he's been invited in this series, is because we do hope that this project is going to be wider than just professional philosophers. He's reached out and had his work featured on the BBC radio and television programs, featured in The Times, The Economist, and many other places. And of course, he's a scholar in this virtue, happiness, and meaning of life project. So join me in welcoming him for the evening's speech.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much indeed, Dean, and may I add my congratulations to Jennifer and to Candace Vogler on their success. Sorry, are you picking this up? Yeah, there we go. Their success in securing a grant from the Templeton Foundation, and I'm grateful also for this university's making itself available in various ways to further that work. I knew John Templeton. He died not very long ago, but I knew him and his wife a little, and nothing ever came of this because sadly death intervened, but it was reported to me that he said, oh, Haldane would be a good person to conduct a project and so on. And apparently he'd mentioned a couple of topics. Anyway, I inquired about this eventually and asked, what did he have in mind? And it was reported to me that he thought financial prudence might be a topic. And I was a little perplexed as to why he thought I might have anything particular to say. Of course, he was thinking I'm Scottish, and so if I'm Scottish, then miserliness might be something that I could investigate. Sad to say that never came about. Nor indeed would I particularly welcome being burdened with having to lead an inquiry into that. But I am very pleased to have some small part in this project that has been funded by Templeton. I'm conscious of the fact that this is a mixed audience. I mean, members of the general public, I imagine. There are academics, I think, from other disciplines, and there will also be people from philosophy. And I'm quite interested, really, in the institution of public lecturing. Over the years, I've given a series of public lectures, the Gifford Lectures, something called the MacDonald Lectures, the Stanton Lectures, and so on. And it's where these are public events, there is always a challenge, really, to try to provide something that colleagues will find sufficiently substantial, but on the other hand won't be a killer as far as other people are concerned. Now, what I'm going to do, and in the course of thinking about that sort of thing, I found it useful to draw a distinction between the introductory and the elementary. I don't in general think it's a good idea to take a subject like philosophy, which is quite a complex and deep subject, and try to sort of summarize philosophical ideas in an elementary fashion, the sort of thing that could be on a single sheet of paper. But I do think it's a good idea to try to give people an introduction to a theme or themes. And an introduction is not part of an introduction to try to disguise from people something of the complexity or difficulty, but it is part of the task of an introduction to try to get them some way into seeing what those issues are and why they matter. And so I think what I will favor this evening is a presentation that doesn't aspire to provide a kind of elementary account of issues, but does hope to give an introduction to some of the issues. Now, the issues that I'm going to be talking about are those of this title, which is also, as you've heard, the title of the project that Jennifer and Candace are directing. I'm actually, I'll say a little bit about how virtue has again become a topic of interest to philosophers, not only to philosophers, actually, to psychologists and others, but I'm a philosopher, so I'll be speaking principally with regard to philosophy. So I want to say a little bit about that, but I do want to move towards the latter part of the title, the meaning of life. And in the course of that, I maybe will express some reservations or some thoughts about the limitation of focusing on virtue. I think that work that has been done in recent times has great merit. It's illuminated various concepts in various ways. It's had some practical utility as well. But I think it needs to be set within a broader context, a broader philosophical context. And in the process of doing that, I think that in ways that has not yet really happened, but I think that one of the benefits of doing that is to broaden and deepen it and to make it of greater interest, virtue inquiries, of greater interest to other philosophers, but it also takes us in the direction of the idea of the meaning of life. And the concept of virtue, the concept of happiness have, obviously very ancient ones that people had a great deal to say about. The meaning of life, actually, is a topic about which philosophers have had less to say, in part because they find I suppose, the sort of Monty Python connotations of the meaning of life. But at any rate, yesterday, I think it was, so I should explain that in the course of the last 7 days, I've been across the Atlantic twice. So I'm feeling slightly battered and bruised. And I will have to be doing another flight on Wednesday, which, for reasons not of convenience really, but of economy, is taking me via, so I am being prudent in a Scottish fashion, is taking me via Frankfurt. So I'll be taking in Germany, however briefly, before I actually get home to bed sometime next Thursday, this Thursday. Now, when I arrived, whenever that was, either yesterday or the day before. What is today? What is today, actually? What is it? Monday, okay. Sunday. Did I arrive on Saturday? All right. So I woke up on Sunday, and I took myself off to the Columbia Museum of Art, and I've incorporated within this lecture some images from that collection. I could have used other images and would ordinarily have done so, but I thought it might actually be quite useful to show you a few images that you then have an opportunity to go and feast your eyes upon at your leisure. And the first of them is this. This is it'll become clearer as we go on as to why I'm showing you these images. This is a rather interesting one. I'm sorry, where the light, are we doing anything about the backlights, or are all lights staying fully on? All lights are staying fully on, okay. It's just that these images won't have the sharpness that they would have if we were in a slightly darker environment. Anyway, this is a rather typical piece of still life of a certain period. It's German, it's 19th century, I think. And in it, what it represents in some ways is a kind of abundance and a sense of the harmony between work, effort, reward, and fulfillment. In a sense, this table of plenty that's set out before us is one in which everything, as it were, is offered to the eye and, of course, to the stomach. But there's a sense of, as it were, merited delight. I mean, both visual delight, but also, as you might imagine yourself, seated at that table. And I think there lies behind it, and it seeks itself to give expression to, a certain sense of harmony. Obviously, there's a compositional harmony in terms of the there's a compositional dynamic as well. I mean, we've got these sort of lines crossing here, so there's a certain dynamic. But on the whole, things are sort of graciously falling forward and so on. And so there's a sort of languorous, poised character to the leaves and to the fruit and so on, and then down here. I'm going to contrast that later with a couple of paintings actually by the Italian 20th century painter Morandi, for reasons to do with existential angst. This artist and his clients, those who commissioned this work, did not suffer existential angst. This represents a sort of degree of contentment and a sense of balance between, as I say, labor, effort, and reward. A connection between work and society, the individual, the wider group, and so on, that was felt to be harmonious, but which, in some respects, I think we've lost. Okay. So virtue, question mark, happiness, question mark, the meaning of life. Well, here's another painting from the collection, John Beaufin's The Wine Tasters, and it's there for no good reason at all, except to allow me to credit the collection of Columbia Museum and ask ourselves the question, does this constitute virtue, happiness, or the meaning of life? I think it's intended here by Beaufin that there's a sort of slightly ridiculing of these two figures. We're to see them as slightly indulgent, and if things were a little sharper, we'd see, in fact, it ought almost to be the case. I'm going to do it for you. There's a sort of glowing red nose on that side of things. He's tasted just a little too much wine. But there is a marked contrast, I think, between the way in which wine features in this, sort of gracefully poised, and the way in which indulgence is a theme in that. Now, with regard to these main elements, I said that the concept of virtue and the concept of happiness, or notions of happiness, have featured rather famously and prominently. You might even say the concept of happiness has been one of the central concepts of moral philosophy from classical antiquity through the Middle Ages, given, of course, a religious transformation in the notion of blessedness, but the idea of good fortune or a kind of completion in life or perfection in life or fulfillment in life and so on, as a goal or target of life certainly features in the figures, beginning with a sort of line up here. Whoops, what have I done? Wait a minute. What do I do? Press that twice? Yeah, thank you. This line up here beginning with Socrates. Father Flannery will remind me, I think that's in the Vatican Museum, isn't it? It looks like the ones in the Vatican Museum, I think, yeah. Anyway, so there we have this sort of lineup associated with the different theories of happiness in the ancient world. And then virtue is up here. So these are some figures that this is not a production of mine, but I just lifted it from somewhere or other. The virtue ethics, and here we see Aristotle, David Hume, to whom I should be returning to both of those in a minute. And then I leave it as a sort of competition for philosophy students and philosophy faculty to work out who the others are. No, I'll give you a bit of a clue. So anybody have a guess on that one? It really doesn't look like him, but I think it must be Alistair MacIntyre. That is Philippa Foot, that's Elizabeth Anscombe. I've no idea who that is. I mean, is it Michael Sandel maybe? I just don't know who that is. Well, good luck. Maybe that's, what's her name? Rosalind Hursthouse, perhaps. Anyway, these are some figures associated with, well, these with historical explorations of virtue, Aristotle, most famously, Hume in the 18th century, and then these 20th century figures gathered here. And I think that's the first thing to say is that this illustration, I don't know whether it's intended to do that, but one thing that's quite significant is there are no intermediary figures. It sort of leaps from antiquity, then to the 18th century, then to the 20th century, suggesting, or at least maybe as a clue to, the idea that the tradition of thinking about virtue was not continuous in Western philosophy in the way in which thinking about happiness was. Now, this third cartoon, or this third image down here, we see this character approaching, looking suitably, I don't know, sage-like or in search of wisdom, and then it tells him he can go that way for the meaning of life or that way for cheese and crackers. So that's the reception outside. And of course, this is one reason why I think the expression, the meaning of life, doesn't really, is not one that philosophers want to be caught having on a piece of paper, because it does sound a bit sort of corny. But I'm going to be talking a bit about this person, Elizabeth Anscombe, and the importance of her work in reviving interest in virtue. But I also am going to be talking about somebody far less well-known, and this is a British philosopher now. She's deceased. Her centenary will be in 2019. This philosopher is still with us. This is David Wiggins. I'll say a little bit about him. My own view is that the essay of Anscombe's that has been very much discussed and read and so on, it is a very important essay in 20th century moral philosophy, but an essay of his, which I'm going to mention also, is no less important and I think in many ways more profound. So what did Aristotle have to say about virtue? Some of these slides, I'm just going to read through them at a pace. We don't really need to dwell on them. I just want to give you the flavor. So Aristotle says, for all things that have a function or an activity associated with them, a characteristic activity. Sorry, is this volume all right? Because I'm conscious as I turn slightly from it, it may be. Is everybody hearing me okay? Yeah, thank you. For all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function. Now, this is me intruding this, as turning evenly resides in the turning of a wheel. So the turning, it might be the function of the wheel, and it doing that work well would be it turning evenly. So evenly might be the excellence of turning, right? You don't want a wheel that sort of sticks and is irregular in its movement and so on. So for all things that have a function or activity, such as a wheel which has the function of turning, the good, or the well, is thought to reside in the function. So what's good for a wheel is to turn smoothly, or turn evenly. And so he says it might seem to be for man. If man, and this is sort of anthropos, as a human being, has a function, and if we state it to be a certain kind of life, and this to be an activity or actions implying reason, and the function of a good man to be the good and noble performance of these, and if any action is well performed when it's performed in accordance with the appropriate excellence, the excellence here standing to man as the turning evenly stood to the wheel. If this is the case, then human good turns out to be activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. So what he's saying here is that virtue is to be understood in terms of the excellence of a function or an activity, and he's interested in what are the functions or activities characteristic of human beings, and if there's more than one, which is the best kind of characteristic activity or function. And since we're rational beings, he thinks it will be one in which reason is involved. And then so he says, since every virtue or excellence both brings into good condition the thing of which it is the excellence, and makes the work of that thing be done well, the virtue, I don't know why I put a question mark, the virtue of man also will be the state of character which makes a good man and which makes him do his own work well. So a virtue will be a kind of excellence or a perfection of a power or a capacity or an activity. These are sort of the same thing at different levels. And so what he's saying is that the key to understanding the good for human beings is to understand their characteristic activities, which is an expression of their nature, and then to see how those might be perfected in terms of the excellence appropriate to those activities. So as it were, if all that man were a draftsman, then consummate artistry would be the excellence of drawing. But of course, human beings are not just drawing creatures, and most of them aren't even that. This is what I'm calling the fourfold Oxonian roots of the analytical revival of moral philosophy. I thought that was a sort of suitably grand and slightly Edwardian title, the fourfold Oxonian roots of the analytical revival of moral philosophy. Oxonian is the adjective pertaining to Oxford. So the fourfold Oxford roots of the analytical revival of moral philosophy. So these four individuals, very striking, they're all born within about 5 years of one another. In fact, I'm chairman of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and the Royal Institute in 2019 will have a series of lectures on the work of these four figures. And the four figures in question are Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, whose grandfather was a president of the United States. She was sort of Anglo-American. Mary Midgley, and the figure perhaps better known to many as a novelist rather than as a philosopher, Iris Murdoch. So we've got Anscombe, Foot, Midgley, and Murdoch. And the remarkable thing is that so she is deceased. About 10 years ago, I was going to arrange a kind of celebratory conference to mark Mary Midgley's life and achievements. And I thought, well, you know, I'm not sure I want to put this on because, you know, quite elderly, and will she be with us at the time? Anyway, that was 10 years ago. She's still going strong, and I think there's a good chance that she might be with us in 2019. I certainly hope so. Now, I'm going to talk mainly about Anscombe, but I'm going to say something about Murdoch. So Anscombe wrote this famous essay called Modern Moral Philosophy, published in 1958. The circumstances of it are interesting, but I won't go into those just now. But basically, the background was that she had not taught moral philosophy before. And the interesting thing about Elizabeth Anscombe, although she's been such an influential figure in moral philosophy, she herself was not much interested in moral philosophy. She never taught moral philosophy. If you look at the classes that she taught, both in Oxford and Cambridge, she tutored for it at one point, and it was the fact of having to tutor for it that led her to read a lot of it. But in general, she was not much interested in moral philosophy. She was interested in ethical questions, particularly questions to do with killing and so on, suicide, war, murder, euthanasia, and things of that kind. But she wasn't interested in moral philosophy per se. And that's very extraordinary when you think that, as the philosophers will know, the great influence of this essay, Modern Moral Philosophy. But what it really is that she, in fact, what happened was that in order to allow Philippa Foot to take a term off to spend on sabbatical in the United States, Anscombe undertook to take on Foot's teaching for that term. Foot was teaching moral philosophy, that was her subject. But Anscombe undertook, said, well, you go and I'll do your teaching. And then said, what should I read? And so Foot sort of, gave her this long list. And she read it all. Under the strength of reading it all, she produced an essay, which was a very remarkable essay. it mostly takes the form of beating great philosophers about the head and lesser philosophers as well, and so on. She really, you wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of criticism from Elizabeth Anscombe. She would make Margaret Thatcher look timid, hesitant, and lacking in resolution. But anyway, in this essay, she says many things. I mean, she was a great philosopher, let me say. I mean, I think that history will judge her to be one of the finest English language philosophers of the 20th century, and by common consensus, the greatest woman philosopher thus far, of whom we have any knowledge. Anyway, she in this essay, she does many things, but here's two things. She said, we need moral psychology. She said, it isn't profitable for us at present to do moral philosophy. That should be laid aside at any rate until we have an adequate philosophy of psychology. I'll say in a moment a bit more about what she thought that might involve. And then she had this other very famous thesis, which was, so this is my language, not hers, we need to get over and get past the moral ought. She thought that this language of you must do this, you must not do that, you're morally obligated, and so on, was deeply problematic, and we would do better to get rid of it and come up with something better. It's problematic because it's mysterious, we can't really understand it, and the reason we can't really understand it is the presuppositions of it are a notion of moral law, this idea of moral dictates, and we don't believe that there is anything that is a moral law out there in the cosmos, either freestanding or expressed from God or whatever, and so we better try to find some other foundation for ethics. Now, in this, when she said about we need a better psychology, this first thing, it's not profitable for us at present to do moral philosophy, we need a better psychology. She goes on to say a bit more about what she has in mind there. And again, I'm afraid to just read this fairly speedily. She says, an explanation is required of how an unjust man is a bad man. She could equally have said of how a cowardly man is a bad man, or how an unjust action is a bad one. When we think back to Aristotle, who said the virtues are those excellences which you need if you are to carry out your characteristic activities as a human being. And she says to give such an explanation belongs to ethics, but it can't even be begun until we're equipped with a sound philosophy of psychology. For the proof that an unjust man is a bad man would require a positive account of justice as a virtue. And that would be true of courage or temperance or whatever other virtue one might point to. And then she says, this part of the subject matter of ethics is, however, completely closed to us until we have an account of what type of characteristic of virtue is. And that's a problem, she thinks, not of ethics, but of analysis. Right? It's a conceptual question. And also how it relates to the actions in which it is realized or instanced, a matter which she thinks Aristotle, she says, did not succeed in really making clear. For this, we certainly need an account, at least, of what a human action is, and how its description as doing such and such is affected by its motive and by the intention or intentions in it. And for this, an account of such concepts is required. So she really is trying to rebuild things from the ground floor. She's saying we've been doing moral philosophy for a long time, assuming that we really understand what we mean by an action and how the value of an action is determined by, say, the intention with which you do it or the circumstance in which you do it. But we really haven't thought those matters through. And until we think them through, we're not really in a position to try to say what's good and bad, what's right and wrong, or at least why things that are good or bad are good and bad. And then she says later, it might remain to look for norms in human virtues, just as man has so many teeth, which is certainly not the average number of teeth that men have, but is the number of teeth for the species. Likewise with arms. You can say how many arms do human beings have? The answer is 2. But we know that the average number of arms is not 2, right? There are some people who only have 1 arm, so if we divide all the arms by the total number of people, it doesn't come out as 2. But nonetheless, there's some sense in which it's true that men have 2 arms. So these are sort of, they're what are technically known as propria, but they're proper characteristics of human beings. So perhaps the species man regarded not just biologically, but from the point of view of the activity of human thought and choice in regard to the various departments of human life, powers and faculties and the use of things needed, perhaps man has such virtues, as it were, the normal man, the normal functioning, adequately functioning man, would have such virtues, just as he would have the powers of speech, facility to move his limbs and so on and such like. And this man with a complete set of virtues is the norm. just like a complete set of teeth is the norm. One way of thinking about that is this. If you ask children, or indeed anyone, to say draw a dog or a cat or a human being and so on, they'll give you a sort of stereotypical outline of a dog or a cat. I mean, it'll have 4 legs, it'll have a tail, and so on. And of course, not all, and they're not drawing that from observation. It's not just there's some cat in front of them that they're observing, right? These are sort of normalized, generalized concepts. And what she's saying is maybe the normalized, generalized concept of a functioning human being is one that will build into it, or have built into it, things like, well, they're courageous. That doesn't mean that every man is courageous, but as it were, any more than every cat has a tail, but nonetheless it's part of the stereotypical characterization. And then, now elsewhere she says, and that was kind of it really, and on the strength of this people thought, gosh, this is extremely interesting, maybe we've been looking in the wrong place and trying to do ethics, maybe we should look at this sort of notion of virtues, of characteristics, features, the possession and exercise of which contributes to the good of the agent, just as the way in which the smooth turning of the wheel contributes, as it were, to the good of the wheel. And so was born, or not directly through her, perhaps through Philippa Foot, but at any rate, a lot of a renewed interest in the concept of virtue, and of course then going back to Aristotle. Now, it's worth pointing out a couple of things that Anscombe, I said she didn't write much about moral philosophy in the sense of moral. She wrote about particular issues, but not moral ideas in the general, the more abstract level. But there are a couple of essays of hers in which she says some interesting things. One of them is this, that the justification of most virtues is actually utilitarian. So she says, for example, some virtues like honesty about property and sobriety are fundamentally utilitarian in character. The very point of them is just the obvious material well-ordering of human life that's promoted if people have these virtues. And you might say the same thing would be true of temperance and courage, right? If people need a degree of courage in order just to get through the day, to face challenges and so on. So the justification of courage is not, I think Anscombe thought, that courage is in itself meritorious or that has some sort of intrinsic feature by which it glows as part of fine character. It's rather, it's just one of the, if you're that kind of animal, then just as indeed as a cat or a dog need a degree of courage, so human beings need courage. So it has a rather plain bread and butter justification. Some, she said, goes on to say, however, though indeed profitable, are supra-utilitarian and hence mystical. I'm going to come back to mystical. And hence mystical. You can argue truly enough, for example, that general respect for the prohibition on murder makes life more commodious. If people really respect the prohibition against murder, if people really, what should that be, believe that the prohibition against, I'm not getting that, there's something gone wrong with that. But basically what she's saying is you'd have to be mad to think that the reason you ought not to murder people is just that life goes easier if you don't, right? So some of these virtues get their explanation from the benefits that they provide from having them, right? But the duty, as it were, or the virtue of respecting the life of another is to be understood in a different way. It's not that it's simply life goes better if you don't kill your neighbors. It's rather that, in some sense, you know you ought not to kill your neighbors because you have a recognition of something like the dignity of human life or the inviolability of human life. And she thinks that kind of idea is supra-utilitarian and, as she says, mystical. Now, here we go, deep breath, right. I'm not going to cover everything that I have in these slides here, but let me just proceed in this way. Supposing you're rather taken with this, you think, well, this is pretty interesting. What we've heard between Aristotle on the one hand and Anscombe on the other suggests that indeed we should, in trying to do moral philosophy and trying to do ethics, we should look at the concept of virtue or concepts of virtue. What exactly would we be saying about virtue? And it seems to me, or virtues, the idea of virtue and the particular virtues. Well, it seems to me there's three things we might be doing, and these are sort of progressively ambitious. So the first degree of virtue involvement, if I can put it that way, would just be to acknowledge that there is evaluation in terms of virtue and vice. And what I mean by that is, we would look around at how people make judgments, and we'd notice that as well as saying that things were right and wrong, good and bad, they also say such things as that that would be cowardly, or that that would be courageous, and so on and such like. So the first level of this would just be to say, well, if we want an understanding of how people think about ethics and how ethics governs their actions, we need to be aware of the fact that as well as having notions of rights and duties, obligations, and so on, there are also these notions of virtue and vice. And we won't have understood moral thought and moral practice if we haven't had something to say about that aspect or those aspects or elements. A more ambitious placing of virtue would be to say, well, as well as just recognizing that people talk that way, we need to actually find a place for virtue in our general ethical scheme. It's not just that we have to acknowledge the fact that people talk that way, we really do need to recognize and find a proper place for that. But then the third and most ambitious way of bringing virtue into ethics would be to give it a foundational role. That's to say, it's not just acknowledging that people talk that way, it's not just finding a place for it in our ethical theories, but it's actually having it as the foundation of ethics, a foundational concept or a foundational role. Now, some people have gone down that route. For what it's worth, that wasn't Anscombe's view. Anscombe didn't think that the concept of virtue had a foundational role. One might then say, well, what did she think of a foundational role? And I think she didn't think anything had a foundational role. There were a plurality of types of considerations. And one of the considerations was what she thought we have a grasp of, though she puts it this way mystically, which is the value of human beings. The intrinsic dignity of human beings, she thought, is something that's central to ethics, recognizing that, but that's not to be understood in terms of either their virtue or your virtue in recognizing it. So there are sort of fundamental value elements in her view. Virtue is important, it has a place, but I think she's really an advocate of position two, granting virtue a component place in the total ethical scheme. Now, there are a series of challenges to virtue ethics, but I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip it. The colleagues will recognize what some of these are about. Let me say something briefly about 2 and 3 here. Ambiguities of priority and the problem of making virtue foundational, which bears on item 3 there, and then the question of knowledge of virtue, because we've heard her say something about it being mystical. Forget that. So with regard to, let's do this question of priority. That was issue number 2. If somebody says that the notion of virtue, or any notion for that matter, has priority, comes first as it were, then you should ask them the question, in what sense? What kind of priority? And there are a variety of different kinds of priority. One is a question of metaphysical priority. So we might say that, for example, an agent is prior to the capacity that they have, and the capacity is prior to its being exercised, and its being exercised is prior to the kind of thing over which it is exercised. So in that sense, we'd say that agents are more fundamental, perhaps, than actions. Right? So that you understand the notion of an action, or it's not just you understand, the thing, an action, is something that is embedded in something more fundamental, namely an agent. That's one sense in which one might try to explore the notion of virtue's priority. A second way of thinking about priority would be a question of educational priority. I think this is quite important. If you want to teach people, let's say you're trying to instruct children in how to behave, what's the best way of doing that? Is it by teaching them rules, moral rules, never do this, always do that, sometimes, and so on and such like? Or is it a question of drawing their attention to the effects of their actions? Or is it simply, and more directly, a matter of habituating them in various ways? So rather as, sorry to put it this way, but rather as you might train a kitten to use a litter tray, you train a child not to lie, right? And then questions about why you shouldn't lie, that comes later. But you don't teach them moral rules, let's say, or you try to encourage in them, say, generosity, and then you think if they've got that, then that's a good place to start. Now, I think it's very plausible to think that virtue has educational priority, that if you want to teach somebody, then just as if you're teaching them a language, it's generally easier not to begin with, as it were, the rules of the grammar. It's just better to get them using the language, and that's why just immersing them in a linguistic environment of the language you want them to learn, just to pick up the habits, as it were, to go along with the way things go. But there's a third question, and that's the question of evaluative priority, which is more fundamental. The evaluation of the agent as good or bad, the evaluation of the action as right or wrong, or the evaluation of the outcome. And one difficulty for the most ambitious form of virtue ethics, or having virtue as the foundation of ethics, is this last issue, because it's very difficult to see. After all, virtues and vices have the same general character. Their dispositions, perhaps habituated, perhaps infused, that's a whole other issue. But anyway, their dispositions or tendencies, liabilities in a way, to, of the will, I suppose we might say, to either choose or to refrain from choosing something. But the difference between a virtue and a vice is given, therefore, not in terms of its internal structure, but in terms of the object towards which it's directed. So the virtuous person, it has a disposition or an inclination or a tendency to choose the good, and a vicious person to choose the bad. So it looks as if the notion of a virtue is going to have to be understood in terms of the good of the end towards which it's directed. So it doesn't look as if the idea of virtue could by itself be foundational. You have to have an independent account of what's good and what's bad, and then characterize the virtues in terms of their proper objects. Forget those whole set of things. Let's go back to knowledge. What's the nature of the kind of knowledge that's involved in virtue? Well, here again, I think it's worth looking at a piece by Anscombe, which is not that well known. Here she's talking about co-natural knowledge, and this is a concept that she gets from Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas himself does not primarily deploy this notion with regard to questions of virtue. He has it as a part of his general account of knowledge. Very broadly speaking, in the ancient world and in the pre-modern world, there was a belief that like is known by like. That if you know something, if you have cognition of something, there must be some sense in which the thing of which you have cognition is in you. There are different ways of getting to that thought. One is that what I think of is present to the mind. So if it's present to the mind, then in some sense it's already with me, right? So I can only think of what's present to the mind, and so what I'm thinking of must in some sense be present. Well, if I'm thinking of a faraway object, it isn't spatially present, so there must be some other way that it's present. And so he thought that there's a kind of co-natural knowledge, that the thing you know, in some sense, has communicated itself to you. And that was where he introduced the idea of co-natural knowledge. But she's using it for a different purpose. She says co-natural knowledge is the sort of knowledge someone has who has a certain virtue. It's a capacity to recognize what action will accord with and what ones will be contrary to the virtue. The person who has no meanness in him, but rather generosity, is liable to avoid or reject some course of action without difficulty, perceiving it to be ungenerous. The one with co-natural knowledge is inclined against the action, and that inclination itself is a sort of perception of the meanness of acting, even without the judgments being formulated. The point here is she's thinking that there's a natural kind of knowledge of virtue that isn't articulated, it's not deliberated, it's not theoretical, it's just a natural knowing. And she says certain sorts of knowledge strike one as being like virtues, or even some of them as being virtue. The knowledge, for example, that a human being is of more worth than many sparrows, for example. That would take a little bit of unpacking. But anyway, there is a sense, she says, of non-indifferent truth, which anyone will concede. Truth is non-indifferent if it helps or frustrates your purpose. I'm suggesting that non-indifferent knowledge arises from experience of life, of suffering, and above all, of moral practice. As habits are created by practices, the wise one will therefore not want to engage in falsehood. Now, the question of moral knowledge has been at the center of moral philosophy for the last 300 years. And the reason for that is that, well, more than one author, but one author perhaps more than any other, a fellow Scot, David Hume. David Hume, in his writings, develops the view that morality is a matter of sentiment or feeling, that the same set of facts, as it were, could be open to approval or disapproval by different persons depending upon their sentiments. And so the natural analogy here would be to think of, say, food with regard to preferences in food. You might say, look, it's exactly the same food that one takes delight in and the other one rejects as disgusting. That there's not, as it were, a correct or incorrect judgment as to whether or not something tastes good or doesn't. That's down to the taster and their liabilities, their sentiments, their likings, and so on, their sensibility, we might say. Now, Hume sought to use this analogy, or something like this analogy, in his account. Oh, what happened there? Do we know what happened? Have we lost it? Yeah. This is going to be the bottom one? This is going to be terrible because we're going to get to the paintings now. Yeah, I've tried the black button. It looks like it's more likely to be a connection problem, but just bear with me for a second. What I promise is if we get it going, I'm just going to skip to the pictures and explain why I'm showing you them. Want to have a shot? Is it timed out? Right, okay. Put it on for 3 hours, all right? There are a lot of pictures. Yeah, that's fine. Now, so Hume, let me just go, oh, right. Let me tell you what he says. Actually, I know this pretty much by heart. Hume says, consider any action allowed to be vicious, examine it in all lights, and see if you can find there that matter of fact in which you pronounce its viciousness to consist. It's only when you turn your reflection within your own breast, you find arising within you a sentiment of disapprobation. Herein lies some matter of fact, but it concerns not the world, but our feelings. All right, so there you go. Here's a matter of fact, but 'tis the object of feeling, not of reason. Okay? The vice entirely of Scripture, as long as you consider it. You can never find it till you turn your reflection within your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation which arises in you towards this action, and so on. So what he says at the end there, vice and virtue therefore may be compared to sounds, colours, heat and cold, which according to modern philosophy, he means science, are not qualities in objects, but perceptions in the mind. So the idea is that that heat, for example, is motion of the particles, but we sense that through phenomenal heat, the sensation of heat and so on. And he's wanting to say that ethics is like that as well, that there isn't, as it were, good and bad in things. The goodness and badness is to be understood in terms of our sensibility and our responses, our reactions to things, as if you like, favouring or disfavouring. Now, Anscombe, there isn't really a time, I'm afraid, to explore all of this, but she has something very useful to say to Hume. But I want to actually shift now to the thing that's going to get me to the pictures very quickly. I think that both in responding to Hume and to thinking about the place of virtue more generally, one thing that it would be useful to do is to start to connect this with a range of other issues in other areas of philosophy. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, I'm afraid, but I'll just indicate them. One is in philosophy of mind in relation to the whole question about the relationship between the internal and the external and thought and action issues. In social philosophy, the relationship of the one and the many. I mean, I see myself on the one hand as an individual, on the other hand, I see myself as one among many. How is virtue related to that perception of myself in relation to others? In relation to the philosophy of history, I think there are very interesting questions about the context of thought and what I call the priority of deed. Richard Weaver, a Southern writer, famously wrote a book called Ideas Have Consequences. I think it was initially an essay. I think there's a good argument for saying that ideas are consequences. I mean, they may have consequences, but they are consequences. And the route into this is through a very telling remark, which I'm now, people are tired of hearing me quote this, but it's from Hegel's Philosophy of Right, where he says when When philosophy paints its grey on grey, then as a form of life grown old, by means of philosophy it cannot be rejuvenated, but only understood. The owl of Minerva takes flight with the falling of the dusk. Wonderful. It's a good thing to have on your gravestone. But at any rate, what Hegel is saying here is that philosophy, if you like, ideas, come after action. That thought, philosophical reflection, is the coming to consciousness of something that is already imminent in activity. Goethe famously said in the beginning was the deed, contrasting, of course, with the prologue to John's Gospel, right? Not in the beginning was the word. He wasn't making an anti-theological point. What he was saying is that action precedes thought. There's a sense in which ideas are a consequence of action. We're already in media res. We're in the midst of activity. And I think trying to understand notions of virtue, we need to locate them to an understanding of history and the way in which history shapes and transforms our lives, and that, in fact, virtue, as it were, is an abstraction out of something already ongoing. However, what I want to end up with is I'm going to say something about existential philosophy, and very briefly. And I'm going to skip what David Wiggins has to say. Well, I'll just tell you, in this wonderful essay called Truth, Invention, and the Meaning of Life, one thing he says, this is, I'll just read the first paragraph. Even now, in an age not given to mysticism, there are people who ask what is the meaning of life. I shall claim to have uncovered the possibility that philosophy has put happiness in the place which should have been occupied in moral philosophy by meaning. Now, I think he's right. I think the concept of happiness is a relatively shallow one, whereas the concept of meaning is a rather deep one. Now, how am I going to do this? All right. I mentioned the fourth of those Oxonian, the fourfold root, and the fourth figure was Iris Murdoch. Now, some philosophers would be familiar with Iris Murdoch's set of essays, The Sovereignty of the Good. It's really, as somebody once said, the same essay written 3 times, but just from slightly different directions. I think it's interesting, but I think in some respects it's sentimental. What I think is much more interesting were Iris Murdoch's earlier reflections on literature, and in particular on what she contrasted as 2 kinds of novelists of the 20th century, that begins really in the 19th century, what she called existentialists on the one hand and mystics on the other. And existentialists, she's thinking primarily in the period in which she's writing of people like Sartre and Camus, but not exclusively those. And then among what she calls the mystics, she's thinking of writers like Graham Greene, the English writer Graham Greene. Now, the difference between existentialists and mystics, as far as Murdoch was concerned, was that the existentialists thought that there is no meaning, and then the question is, how do you live under those conditions? Camus famously said in the Myth of Sisyphus, the question for us today is suicide. Why not kill yourself if there is no meaning? And I think that Camus' question is a quite serious one. I think there are fashions and times have changed and so on, but I actually think the Myth of Sisyphus is a very good book, and it poses a very good question, which is, somebody might say, well, don't give up, you can be happy. But one question would be, look, what's the relationship of happiness to my life having meaning? And some people, of course, just try to reduce the notion of meaning to happiness, but I don't think that will do. Now, very quickly, I'm going to skip some things here. You could have got a very interesting art history talk about changing styles of portraiture from late Roman sarcophagi portrait, naturalistic portraits, to the rise of Byzantium, but I'm going to skip that. One thing that Murdoch is interested in is the way in which literature, the arts more generally, but really literature was her subject, and she didn't really know that much about the visual arts, but how for the mystical, what she calls the mystical tradition, and let me explain what she meant by that. She didn't mean something sort of weird and sort of, strange experiences and so on. She thought that the existentialists thought there is no foundation for life, and so the appropriate response to that is irony, or just, saying, damn it, I'm going to live anyway. There is no meaning to my life, but I'm not going to be undone by that fact. I'm just going to keep going. Just a sort of assertion of the will. Whereas the mystics were looking for some foundation, something metaphysical in one way or another. Now, in this way of thinking about mystics, this is a strange category because Marxists turn out to be mystics. Marxists are people who are looking to history and class struggle and the inevitable dialectic of materialism, of class interest, and so on, as a kind of underlying reality in terms of which we can find meaning in our own lives by placing our own struggles within the struggles of classes over times. Or if you think of Augustine, for example, Augustine thinks that the age of the sacred history of creation, covenant, breach of covenant, restoration, and so on, is played out in each individual's life, that we can find meaning in our own experiences by producing a narrative of our own lives, of our efforts and our failings and so on, that relates it to the narrative of Scripture, that sees, creation in us, a breach in covenant with God, an attempt to try to overcome that, and so on. That sort of narrative writ large in sacred history, we find sort of written again in our own lives. That's another mystical foundation. It's an attempt to try to understand the meaning of our own experiences in terms of something external to us. So the Marxists offer it in one way, Augustine and sacred history offers it in another way. Within Judaism, obviously, the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, enables the Jew to understand their own position in relationship to the fate of Israel, which is itself understood in terms of covenanted promise and so on. But one thing that I'm very interested in, the way in which visual art is a means of seeking to provide what, in this Murdochian terminology, we'll call a mystical foundation, but I would prefer to call a metaphysical foundation. Now, this is obviously religious art, but the reason I wanted to show you it is I think that there's a kind of degradation across this. I mean, this piece on the right-hand side, all three pieces actually are in the local museum. The one in the middle is a Flemish book of hours from about 1450. The other one to the left is about 40 years later, Flemish. And then the one over here is Mannerist, Tintoretto, or School of Tintoretto. But I would just want you to observe the way in which as kind of erotic fetishization has begun to enter in to the depictions of the crucified Christ. Here, this is actually a portrait of the Trinity. But the sort of coquettish twisting and turning of these angels, even the sort of languorous poise of Christ himself, starts to sort of take on a kind of sensuality. Whereas in the Book of Hours, things are much more, as it were, focused on the reality of what is supposed to be going on. Now, for this reason, although the Mannerist painting, of course, is in many respects brilliant, I think in other respects it represents a kind of shallowing out of the search for meaning. I'm going to... There's a contrast between shallow and profound interpretations of the human condition. Rembrandt's Bathsheba in her bath, and somebody called Antyllus. So anyway, yeah, we could discuss that. But I want to shift now to still life. I'll be very quick. I want to shift to still life. This is the sort of thing that you can easily buy on the internet. You can get them painted in Chinese for you, in China for you. They do them quite well, actually. There are factories that knock out this sort of stuff. But I want to contrast this with a detail from Chardin. Sorry, the illumination is making this very difficult. But there is a kind of narrative unfolding here. I mean, this is almost, you might say, a kind of Aristotelian portrait. I mean, the form of life is expressing itself. There's movement. You can't, I'm afraid, see it here. But if you put it against that, I mean, all movement is over here. I mean, there's of course, a certain element of a sort of sinuous serpent line here. But really, this is just purely decorative. But here we have a genuine exploration of life. And now, this is a piece of photorealism, painting and so on. But it seems really to participate in the trashiness of its subject matter. I mean, the painting itself, although there's a sort of consummate artistry involved in that, it really has absolutely nothing to offer. The best you could possibly say is it's ironic. It's trying to sort of have the shiny quality of the objects it depicts. But if the best we can do is irony, then that really amounts to not much of a contribution. But I want to contrast it, with these paintings by mid-20th century Italian painter Giorgio Morandi. These are, I think, very profound paintings. I'd have to say quite a lot about them, but I'm not going to. One thing, just notice, for example, the way in which the objects in the painting are themselves imbued with character and even personality. Here they're brought forward to the surface, to the edge of the table. They're aligned in a certain way. There's something sort of regimented about this. There's something as if each doesn't quite get a chance to occupy its own space, but has been forced into a space. By bringing them forward to the edge of the table in which they're posed, and thereby to the edge of the canvas, there's a certain sense of imbalance. Are they moving forward? Are they going to fall over? What exactly is happening here? They're also like characters arranged along the front of a stage. And you could think of a kind of drama in which there isn't or occupancy of the full depth of the stage. There isn't a naturalistic sort of representation of life. The whole thing has become tense. Figures are pushed up against one another. And in a way, this is what Morandi is doing is exploring aspects of the human condition and the kind of existential anxiety that we feel. You'll see that these objects are irregular in their shape. It wasn't that he couldn't paint symmetries. These are actually the irregularities of human life. You might say that Morandi's painting is a response to the following fact: the fact that we come into a world not of our own making, under conditions we didn't choose, in circumstances over which we have very little control. That is the human condition, vulnerability. And that vulnerability and sense of angst is here imbued in these paintings. What I'm saying is that Morandi is looking for a mystical foundation. He's looking for an account of ourselves, which he's now exploring poetically. This is no longer religious art in the sense in which those early paintings were, but it is metaphysical art. It is painting as an exploration of the human condition. Now, I think Morandi's conclusion about the human condition is a little like Sartre's or Camus'. It's an unsettling one. I just want to end with a settling representation of the human condition, and this will be it. This is a picture of a very brilliant then young man. He was about 17 or 18 there. He is one of the greatest living British artists. I think he's one of the most interesting sculptors of the 20th century. His work was really quite original. I mean, it's very difficult to sort of trace lines. There are, of course, some influences, as it would always be the case. But this is him turning up at art school, St. Martin's School of Art in Tottenham Court Road in central London. And there he is. He's got his he's got his bicycle and he's got his bow tie and his little backpack and so on. And he looks all set to go painting. But he doesn't go painting. In 1967, he produces this work, A Line Made by Walking, in which he simply does just that. He walks on the surface of the grass. Very difficult to see what on earth could be going on in that work, but just bear with me. Within about a year, he makes this work. You can't really see this very well, I'm afraid, but just here there's a white circle. You can just about see that. There's a white circle. And what he's done is he's taken some wood, painted it white in pieces and so on, and then assembled it on the hillside. And over here he has a little frame. And he photographs, we're seeing it side on, but he photographs through the frame, and there is a photograph of this work in which you've got the seeming frame like that, and then the circle in the middle. But what he's showing us here is the final dissolution of representation, that the idea that you're viewing the world through something is now abandoned, and the work is in the world itself. Art becomes, as it were, part of the world in a way that hitherto it was not, save in a sort of trivial natural sense. It's just another object. And then, 69, he climbs Mount Kilimanjaro and begins a series of walks, which he's continued ever since. Some of these walks, the longest walk he's ever made, I think, was a 5,000-mile spiral. But he spends probably 8 months of the year traveling the world in complete isolation, walking. This is a stunning piece, Driftwood on the Arctic Circle. Now, what I want you to see here is that it's formally composed in some ways. It even looks like a Rothko painting where you've got these sort of stratification. What it is there, well, obviously there's the sky, there's the water, there's the earth. So there's a sort of sense of the elements, right? But what he's done here is the driftwood that's just been washed up along the shore, he's assembled it round into a kind of tight spiral, or circle, certainly, sort of filled. These are all just driftwood. And what it is if you remember as a child perhaps with iron filings and a magnet, and you sort of move the things around. It's as if this is an expression, a demonstration, you might say, of the movement that underlies the surface of things. So there's a sense here in which, as it were, everything is coming together to produce that. I mean, the water pushes the wood onto the shore, and then it's as if there's something continuing in this process of drawing things in. This is stones in Switzerland. These are just stones lying on the ground which he's set upright, but this is one I want really to just dwell on for a moment or two. This is a line of stones in Scotland. His work is all over the world. In wilderness and various places. You will see a Richard Long in every major collection in the world. If you go to any major art gallery in the world, you'll see at least one Richard Long. Those of you who know the Metropolitan the National Museum in Washington, D.C., there's one there, but they're all over the place. Very interesting thing here. This is absolutely minimalist, but it is alchemical. Remember, the alchemists sought to turn base metal into gold. What he's done is take stones just lying around here and transform them. He's brought them to life. And these stones, which are just, he's been walking in this landscape, probably 200-mile spiral or something of that sort, and he's stopped here, and he's spent time and probably slept overnight and so on, and then just lifted these stones. And what we end up with, a little like the Morandi, is these are now invested with human nature. These stones, in a sense, are us journeying. There's, the differences, well, the short and the tall and the small and so on, they're like figures on a pilgrimage. But unlike Morandi, where we just have the figures, here we have a destination. This, it seems to me, for Richard Long, this stands to the medieval painters or the medievals on their journey, say, to Jerusalem. This is, as it were, the divinity, or the intimation of the divinity in Richard Long's work. This is one in Africa, and I'm stopping. Good. So the final point really to say is this, that I think that the appeal to virtue is extremely important, and much of the work that's going on from colleagues who are involved in this project has really made enormous advances. I mean, in the prior work they've done, and I'm sure in the course of this project, enormous advances in understanding the fine-grained texture of the diversity of virtues and the way that they interlock one with another, the balance of forces and so on. But I also think that we need to think about the question of the meaning of life and the larger context in which life goes on. And in thinking about the meaning of life, we'd have two options, in a sense. We have, broadly speaking, the existentialist option, which is to recoil from the absence of meaning. Or we have what Iris Murdoch called the mystical option, what I'm calling the metaphysical option, which is to try to probe reality in ways to see if there is there a foundation for our meaning. And what I've suggested through these visual artists, I could have done this with poets, with others and so on, is, or music for that matter, where actually there is no, as it were, there is no gap between the representation and the reality. Which is one reason why, of course, people think of music as being the most pure art form, but also it's very natural to think of music as somehow coming from another world. It's in another place, as it were. I mean, we hear it here, but what we're hearing is an entry into another world. So I think music is a very interesting vehicle for the exploration of the metaphysical. But what I've been suggesting is that the visual arts here show us what it would be to be engaged in an inquiry into the meaning of life, using, as it were, metaphors and analogies and such like. It's not necessarily the case that the only answer to the question of the meaning of life would be an obviously religious one, as was assumed in the Middle Ages. It might be the sort of way of placing ourselves in the world that's suggested by, let's say, Richard Long's work, that seeing that we recover from these images, as it were, a sense of our own dignity and worth, as we, as it were, proceed on journeys that have their own individual destinations, but may have no common destination. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to stop. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Haldane. Okay, we have some time for questions, if anyone from the audience would like to ask Professor Haldane a question.
Just remind me how I go back to having this, just in case I want. Oh, maybe that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Great.
Justin?
I'm sorry. Is there somebody? Are you waiting for a microphone? Yeah.
Why not?
You might want to do this, by the way, because I presume if you're recording, you will probably want to have whoever's listening to this to be able to hear the questions. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
I'm curious what you take to be the standard we should use, or the family of standards we should use for assessing this notion of the meaning of life. So your choice of turning towards art suggests some kind of aesthetic characterization, something that we find beauty in, or something we find style in, or something along those lines. And I was wondering if you think, okay, well, that's what we're going to be looking for. We're going to be looking for something that makes our life, or a standard for, or a notion of meaning that makes our life beautiful in some way, or is there something else you want to?
Thank you. No, that's very helpful. So I suppose two things. Of course, it could literally be the case that somebody found particular meaning by giving their lives over to certain artistic endeavors, for example. And that is, that could be a kind of fulfillment, which, by the way, I think is independent of happiness. At least it depends how one understands happiness. In an ordinary superficial notion of happiness, and I'm not suggesting that philosophers for a moment would have a superficial notion of happiness, of course. But in an ordinary, though some, of course, famously have done, if you think of Bentham and Mill in the 19th century, Mill less, but certainly Bentham, as simply pleasure and pain, there's no particular reason to think that a life of great meaning need be a life of great happiness, I think. I mean, we want to see a harmonious coming together, a convergence of meaning and happiness, but I don't think it's by any means guaranteed by those concepts, unless you just interdefine them. You're not going to count a life meaningful unless it's happy. You're not going to count a life happy unless it's meaningful. But it's certainly the case, I think, that the arts are one form of life in which people have found great profundity. But I wasn't actually so much suggesting that as suggesting that art provides, as it were, a way into seeing what a quest of this sort might be like. And the way in which I would put it is something like this. If somebody says, look, you're going to have to spend a few minutes justifying that to me, or as I say, that, I think that, attention to what's there, kind of spend time with it, think about it, let it sort of speak to you, see what the connections are with other things, see how it interlocks with other dimensions of human experience and meaning and so on and such like, that this becomes, as it were, to use the jargon, a kind of phenomenological investigation, right? That I may just say that the philosopher whom I mentioned, though unfortunately wasn't able really to discuss, David Wiggins, in the course of that wonderful essay, Truth, Invention, and the Meaning of Life, takes a sort of phenomenological turn, which is very untypical among analytical philosophers of the period. He's deeply influenced in that by a Hungarian philosopher, Orel Kolnai, a little-known figure, though I think an important philosopher. And David Wiggins was Orel Kolnai's literary executor. I am now Orel Kolnai's literary executor. Wiggins handed on to me that particular baton, as it were. But one of the things that I want to try to do in future years is to make Orel Kolnai's work much better known. But he belongs within a kind of Austro-Hungarian school of phenomenological analysis. And what these people did in these works was to try to, as it were, attend to sort of quieten the whole thing down, right? And they didn't look at activity as being the primary mode of human being. They thought of consciousness as being, in some sense, right? Action is obviously very important, but what we do is explore the dimensions, say, of human affection, for example, seeing what's going on. This, by the way, is the kind of thing that is being done by people exploring, or analogous to what people are doing in exploring virtue. But say, a fine-grained attention to notions of attraction or revulsion, or what it is we find meaning of. Asking yourself the question, what is it about this that repels me? Or what is it about this that attracts me? And as it were, in that exploration of response, beginning, as it were, to pick up the structure of the things to which one is responding, what you might call or think of as it were, the fabric of value in reality, and beginning to discern within that, analogous to discerning a meaning within a picture, discerning a meaning within, as it were, reality itself. Now, of course, that could go in different directions depending on the nature of the inquiry. It might lead in a religious direction, I mean in a familiarly religious direction, or it might lead in a sort of quasi, maybe pantheistic religious direction. But, you know, people do have a strong sense, as it were, of the significance of life, of living things. I think that's part of what animates, say, environmental concerns and so on, that there's a sort of, you know, the sensitivity to this sort of beating heart of the, or not hearts, as it were, of the world. That the surface of the world has a life and a structure to it. I don't mean that literally. I mean, you know, and I think that's so. Art could be one way in which one finds oneself in the world, places oneself in the world in a way that gives meaning. But also, the analogy of art or the metaphor of art is a way of thinking about, just as one would respond aesthetically, one might respond in other ways to the world, and through these responses begin to pick up dimensions and modes of meaning, of which the aesthetic probably would be one, but by no means the only one. Gentlemen, just direct. All right, so you'll know the order of these, but there's a gentleman immediately present to you.
In a way, you characterized existentialism as Sartre would have done so. As Sartre would have done so.
Right.
But what would you have done with those existentialists like Marcel and others who had a quite different perspective?
They did, yeah.
Would they be mystical or existential?
Well, okay. Thank you. It's a good question. So there are a whole from Jaspers, Gabriel Marcel, and so on, and you find strains of existentialism in other thinkers as well. Somebody who I didn't mention, but of course, you know, famously Simone de Beauvoir would be another instance. But I think that, so we could think of existentialists in two ways. We could think of them, as it were, as motivated by certain questions. I mean, actually thinking there is a real question here. What is the meaning of life? It isn't one of those sort of silly things you find in a cracker. There really is a question of what is the meaning of life. And then we move to the, as it were, the absurdists, if you like. That's one family within those questioners who, and of the most famous, I suppose, who come to the conclusion, not that the question is meaningless, but that it doesn't have a positive answer, right? And then that's going to give us Sartre, de Beauvoir. Camus is a complicated individual, actually, particularly in the final stages of his life, particularly as we know from recovered papers, which have posthumously been published. Camus was on a religious track at that point. But then you certainly have people like Gabriel Marcel and so on, who are Christian existentialists. And of course, people will look back to Kierkegaard as a kind of inspiration for some part of this. So I don't think that, as it were, giving attention, and perhaps even in ethics or the philosophy of value, priority to the question of the meaning of life as opposed to the question of happiness, I don't think that giving that's to be, as it were, an existentialist in the broad sense, or to think there's an inquiry to be made here. And then, as it were, you're going to get people who say, as it were, the counterparts of atheists, there is no answer, right? Or there's nothing there, put it that way. And then you're going to have the counterpart of theists, as it were, who think there is something there. I'm not necessarily saying they are, necessarily religious believers, but you come back with a positive answer. And then you're going to be people who are sort of suspended in an agnostic condition. And I think to some extent, if you look at these authors, you can see those moments in each of them in a way. Another figure who is never thought of as an existentialist, but who I think can be mapped into that very interestingly, is George Orwell. But that would have to be another story. I think Orwell's a very profound thinker. I put Orwell in the company of Camus. I think they're both. But at any rate, sorry. So thank you very much for that question. I think there's a gentleman. Yes, thank you.
Yes. I apologize for that. I really have a series of questions. I'll just sort of put them together. And I think they relate more to this project than necessarily the answers that it may come up with, but let me just share these and you can pick up whatever parts of it you'd like to respond to. I'm wondering...
So you have a series of questions that relate perhaps as much to the project as to what I've been saying, but yes. Okay,
yes. To what degree may this project involve applied behavioral research and also experiential learning and the qualitative analysis rather than quantitative analysis in arriving at interests? And how do you see this effort at the meaning of life relate to E.O. Wilson's the meaning of human existence. A little further, the biological searches for the sources of altruism.
Yes.
And then finally, they referred to about action preceding thought, but much brain research seems to indicate that thought precedes action considerably ahead of time.
Thank you. I did say in one of my slides here, I did talk about, we never got around to that, but some connections, you know, other issues, as it were, here in philosophy of mind and things of that kind. But I actually wanted to, I mean, there are various issues under some of these headings. I'm not going to discuss these now, but, you know, certain assumptions about action issuing from enduring subjects and states, about a unitary source rather than distributed functions and so on. And that's partly connected to some of what you were talking about. One thing I didn't discuss, though I think it's extremely important, is the question as to whether or not these questions of meaning and morality or ethics more broadly, as it were, are subverted by evolutionary psychology, by explanations that would try to give an account of why we think the things we do or value the things we do in terms of certain adaptations that you know, got through the filters in earlier generations. I think there is no such threat, but let me just say very quickly why that is. It's analogous to a different kind of challenge, a radical challenge to talking about the meaning of life or so on, or values, that was posed by Marxists at a certain period. Because Marxists would say that there's a kind of false consciousness going on here. The real driving forces are economic. You know, you're not aware of them in your life, but they're below and they're shaping. They determine your position within the class structure. These are the kind of forces that really shape things. Now, there is, sorry, I'm conscious that we probably ought to be going to get the hospitality, but I'll just, and I don't want to, no Scotsman would want to get between an audience and a drink, so I'm going to have to sort of work out. But there were very popular works in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, really, and to some degree 70s. Some of you might know a book by Peter Berger called Ways of Seeing, which was an attempt to provide a kind of Marxist analysis. And very characteristic of that would be, for example, to say, well, if you want to understand Flemish portraiture, the rise of Flemish portraiture and the period in which it did arise, this is to do, for example, with the emergence of a mercantile class who had relatively little power, actually, but sought to aggrandize themselves in terms of an older nobility and aristocracy, because the middling classes were tended to be looked down upon by the aristocratic classes and so on. And so they started to have portraits of themselves made that aped the tradition of portraiture of the aristocrats and such like. Now, that's quite interesting. But what it doesn't tell you is whether this is a better painting than that one. Right? What I mean is, it may tell you something about the generation of portraiture at a given point in what was then part of the Spanish Empire, I suppose, and partly ambitions of people in Antwerp and so on to establish their independence. But it isn't going to answer the question, is this well drawn? Is this a better painting than that one? And so on. Those kinds of questions are internal to the practice of painting. So the external explanation may set a framework within which things happen, but those things need to be interpreted in terms of the values that are constitutive of them as practices and so on. And likewise, evolutionary psychology, for instance, might set a framework within which it's intelligible that certain kinds of things are going on. I mean, sometimes people have tried to interpret our reactions to landscape, for example, in terms of the prospect refuge structure of landscapes for our ancestors way back and so on. But that's not going to, as it were, settle the question as to whether or not, you know, this or that is a beautiful landscape and such like. These are kind of internal to the structure of experience, let's put it that way, experience of a sort that is articulated and made intelligible at the level of consciousness. Whereas the Marxist on the one hand and the evolutionary psychologist on the other are trying to provide a framework or try to give an account in terms of the determinants of consciousness, but they really fail to give an account of the contents of consciousness. That would be my... Now, many more larger issues there. There are other aspects of evolutionary theory that I think are very interesting. But just remember, human life is conducted at the level of the phenotype, not the genotype. I mean, you know, what genes tell us what the mechanism of heritability are, but they actually, I think there are some very profound errors in thinking that is where what constitutes human life in its experienced mode is to be understood, as it were, from the gene upwards. The gene gives the framework within which experience occurs, but everything that I've been talking about is at the level of lived experience, lived, conscious, distinctively human experience. May I let that suffice for the present? Thank you.
Thank you.